Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We have about a half hour here. Very generous donation of time from 2008 UC Law graduate Aftab Pureval, whose current role is the Hamilton County Clerk of Courts. Couple of notes about the WebEx here. It looks like everybody's on mute, and I ask that you stay on mute. And if you have a question, go ahead and take yourself off and ask. We'll get to questions after Aftab speaks for a bit. Aftab Pureval has a very exciting and unique career path, and he does a much better job of telling his story than I do. But just as a quick overview, graduated from UC Law in 2008, and he moved to Washington, D.C. to practice for one of the largest law firms in the country at White & Case, practicing antitrust litigation. Following that portion of his career, he moved back to the Cincinnati area and worked for the Department of Justice, and then moved on to one of the largest corporations in the world, which is Procter & Gamble. And then in 2016, and I'm a political junkie, so this is a little bit of commentary, was elected Hamilton County Clerk of Courts, for my money, one of the best and most interesting races that we've had in recent Hamilton County memory. Always extremely generous with his time with UC Law, very inspirational, and very happy to have him. Aftab?
James, thanks so much for having me. Is it the first conversation of this kind? Is this the inaugural event?
You're kicking it off.
Oh, great. Well, no pressure. I'm sure we'll all learn from this sound check experience. But I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, James, and thanks so much for inviting me. Thanks so much for putting together this creative forum to engage with staff, with students, with incoming students, and with prospective students. To everyone who's joined, I really appreciate it, and I hope this is worthwhile. The prompt that I was asked to talk about was times where you've persevered, times that are tough, times where the work has had to go on, had to continue, and I think that's obviously a very appropriate prompt for what we're all living through right now. Whether you're just coming to law school or whether you're in law school right now, you understand the challenges that you're facing with remote learning, with trying to create community from your living room, and hopefully my story will shed light on not only how I've persevered in the past, but how, as the clerk of courts, the top administrator in the courthouse, how we're continuing to push the courthouse forward. So let me start at the beginning, because I'd like to talk for just maybe 10 minutes or so about my story, and then hopefully take some questions and have a conversation. The beginning of my story starts with my parents. I'm the son of a refugee. My mom is from Tibet and forced to flee when the communists took over. She grew up in India, met my father, who's from India, which is why I look, vaguely ethnic. It's hard to place where I'm from. But I'm half Tibetan, half Indian. Parents got married, decided to come to the United States. And of all places in the country, they chose Beaver Creek, Ohio, because, of course, you want to go to that thriving metropolis. They immigrated here in 1980. I was born a couple years later in 1982. Pretty standard suburban Ohio upbringing. Went to public schools, then off to Ohio State, where I got my first taste of politics. I was student body president at Ohio State, and then moved down to Cincinnati for the first time to attend the UC College of Law. Had just an amazing time at UC for prospective students or incoming students. I'm really excited for you, because the community that you're going to find at UC is really extraordinary, and it's the result. It's the primary reason for the success that I've had in my own career. Was on law review, did the domestic violence clinic, just engaged in a lot of wonderful opportunities that the law school has to offer. And because of those great opportunities I had with clinic learning and with relationships with professors, I actually had a lot of opportunities to move around the country, or even here in Ohio, at some really nice and attractive job opportunities. In hindsight, I think I maybe made the wrong decision as a 2L looking to 3L and beyond. Instead of really doing the work of thinking about what I want to do and what I want my career to be about, I made the easy decision in hindsight to reach for the money and the prestige. And I took a job after law school at White & Case in Washington, D.C., as James mentioned, one of the biggest, most prestigious law firms in the world. And I was practicing antitrust litigation, not because I had a passion about antitrust, but because that's what they offered me. And again, I wanted to be in the big city. I wanted to be making a lot of money. I wanted to have White and Case on my resume without really thinking what my values were and what I wanted from my career. And that really set me up for the first of 4 instances where resilience and stick-to-itiveness really challenged me. I started at White and Case in September of 2008, the same day that Lehman Brothers went under, which really precipitated the 2008 housing crisis and economic crash. And so my class was really lucky in that we graduated. That last 2008 law school class was the last class of the booming economy of the early 2000s. But my career started the day the economy just fell apart. And so for all intents and purposes, I was stuck at White and Case. Now, I was privileged to have a job, and certainly to have a job that was paying me so well, but there were no opportunities to leave. There were no opportunities to lateral. There were no jobs. People had hiring freezes. They were reducing staff. They were eliminating attorneys and partners. The only reason I kept my job at White and Case is because as a first-year associate, I was cheap labor. But the unintended consequence of all that was there was still a lot of work. There were fewer attorneys to do it. And so I was just working constantly. For the 4 years I was at White and Case, it was some of the most intellectual and most challenging and interesting cases and issues I've ever worked on. But I was burning the candle at both ends, just nonstop working. And I was just incredibly unhappy. I was living in a really unhealthy way. At 26 years old, I started smoking. Who starts smoking at 26? I was just so overcome with anxiety. I was trying to find any way out, and it really forced me to do the work of what do you want to do? What do you want your career to be about? What do you want your legacy to be? What are your values and what's important to you? And so in 2012, still in the housing crisis and the economic downturn, the challenge that I faced was, do I take this risk of leaving in a really tough economy, or do I stay and continue to be miserable? And so my first example of rising to the occasion and facing resiliency is that decision that I made. I chose to bet on myself. I chose to prioritize my values and what was important to me over what might have been perceived as the safer choice, which was to stay put. And I thought to myself, what do I want to do? What do I want to use my law degree to do? And I thought there was no higher honor than representing the government of the United States. So I wrote a letter to the United States Attorney for the Southern District of Ohio. At the time, his name was Carter Stewart. He didn't know me. I didn't know him, but I wrote him a letter and said, I've got 4 years of high stakes litigation experience. Can I come home, work for you for free for a year? And, shockingly, he said yes. So I was on my mom's couch for a year, practicing in federal court, prosecuting federal crimes, primarily including child pornography. But it was an incredible honor. It pushed me to get back home to Cincinnati. It pushed me to really think about what I wanted for my career, and that decision to risk working for free for a year and coming home in a really tough economy really set me up for my current career, which is public service. After that experience, I transitioned to a job at Procter & Gamble. I was the global brand attorney for Oil of Olay at P&G, and I really enjoyed that work. It was different and challenging. But then in my career timeline, I'm brought to my second example of resiliency, and that is public service was something that I was always inspired by. My early experience in politics as a student body president at Ohio State inspired me to continue to think about how public service could ultimately be my career choice. And in 2016, I thought that was the best opportunity I was going to have to run and to potentially win. And so I decided to run for the clerk of courts, which is, not a sexy position, let's be honest. Most people have never heard of the clerk of courts. And if you have heard of the clerk of courts, it's bureaucratic, it's boring, it's not about progressive change, which is something that I was passionate about. But from my perspective, particularly as a former prosecutor, I saw how important access to justice is how our courts are special. They're the one place where it shouldn't matter what you look like, where you're from, or how much money you have. That's the one place where the playing field should be absolutely equal. And we all know, whether we're law students, prospective law students, staff, or lawyers, we all know that's crap. In Hamilton County and the rest of the country, in our justice system, despite our highest ideals, it matters a great deal what you look like, where you're from, and how much money you have. And the clerk of courts, while not thought of in the same way as prosecutors or police or judges in justice reform, clerk of courts is the front door to the courthouse. And so if that front door is inaccessible, if it's antiquated, it really undermines the rest of our justice system. So I was actually excited to put my hat in the ring and run for this position. You know, the resiliency part comes now, which is when I told people, Democrats, party leaders, even my friends and family, that I wanted to run for this position. They said, "Are you crazy? What is wrong with you? You're going to run against Tracy Winkler, the incumbent at the time." The Winklers are basically a Republican dynasty in politics here locally, in conservative Hamilton County, for a position no one cares about or has heard of. Oh, by the way, you're a brown dude named Aftab. That's not a strong ballot name. And so I really had to think about, is it worth risking my career at Procter & Gamble, risking my legal career that I've worked so hard at and at this point was succeeding at, for a position, clerk of courts, that was perceived to be unwinnable and that didn't seem all that interesting to most people. And again, I was forced to think about what my priorities were, what my values were, what I wanted out of my career and my life, and it resulted in me running. And worked really hard, creatively campaigned, and ultimately was successful. And I'm really proud of winning, but also what we've achieved. And you know, my relationship with the law school was really formed when I was a law student there, but it's really come to fruition as the clerk of courts. I've worked with James, with Kate Christoph, with Dean Williams on a bunch of access to justice programs, making sure that our law students get into the courthouse, get experience with real live clients, and understand the power that they and the privilege that they have as attorneys. And my final example of resiliency was in 2018. I ran for Congress. It was not something that I planned to do. It was not something that I wanted to necessarily do in 2016. But I felt, particularly as the son of a refugee, particularly as a person of color, that the direction of the country under President Trump was wrong, and that I needed to put my hat in the ring, jump in the arena, and stand up to what I felt was a real threat to our government and democracy and country. And it was a tough race. It was a really negative race. It was really challenging from a personal, emotional, and physical perspective. And we ultimately lost. And, you know, after you put yourself out there in such a public and vulnerable way, after you work so hard for over a year, and you come up short. Now this district Steve Shepard was winning this district by 20 points, and we got it down to 4. You know, we lost, but I'm ultimately really proud of that. But nevertheless, we lost. You really do. You really are challenged to, again, think about, why are you doing this? Why are you in public service? Why are you running for these positions? Why are you spending your time? You know, I don't talk about this a lot, but making less money, right, than you could be otherwise in the private sector. And it again goes back to that initial point of resiliency. When I was a law student, I reached for the money and the prestige and the security. And now, as someone who's a little bit more mature, more experienced, even in the depths of losing that congressional race, I've never wavered from what was important to me, which was having some kind of social justice and progressive impact on our community. And so even though I lost, the work continues. We continue to innovate in the clerk of courts office. We continue to push the envelope. We continue to create coalitions with judges to continue to reform our justice system and to push to make our society more just, more equitable, and ultimately more compassionate. And I'm really proud of that. But finally, I want to talk about the resiliency of right now. This is a really tough time. It's a tough time for law students. It's a tough time for folks who are just entering the workplace, or folks who have been in the workplace. I can identify with this crop of law students a little bit, because as I mentioned, I graduated in 2008 and was a young lawyer in the midst of the housing crash. And I can understand the uncertainty that you feel, and the anxiety that you must feel. And I feel it right now too. I've got 200 employees working at the Clerk of Court's office. The county, because of the catastrophic result of the economic downturn, has had to cut services by 20%. They've asked me to cut my office by 20% because 90% of my budget is personnel. There's no way for my employees to avoid being affected by this. And so unfortunately, we've had to furlough every single employee on staff or reduce salaries for every employee, including myself. I've cut my salary by 15%. But the work continues. We are in this position because we're public servants. Service to the community is paramount. And so despite the epidemic, despite the furloughs, despite the salary reductions, the Clerk of Court's office has been open this entire time. And it's because the public servants who work here understand that people's constitutional rights cannot take a sick day. If you're sitting in jail and you're innocent, it doesn't matter if there's an epidemic raging outside the jail walls. Our country is a country of laws and of the Constitution, and it's incumbent upon the judicial officers, including the clerk's office, to ensure that system of government and that justice system continues to move forward in a just and equitable and an efficient way. And despite the extraordinary challenges that we're all facing, I'm really proud that my staff has continued working. Now, if I can step back and just talk largely on a more broad level, I think the epidemic has laid bare the inequities that our country has just kind of taken as normal. When we see who is considered essential, first responders, hospital workers, people working at Kroger, people working at FedEx, sanitation workers who pick up your trash. Oftentimes, these are not the most highly paid people in our community or in our country. And on top of that, the added insult of then furloughing or reducing their salaries while they have to continue to come into work is just grossly and fundamentally unfair and unjust. And I hope as we open back up, we'll take a hard look at what we prioritize in this country, what we value and what we think about as essential, and hopefully we can come together with some large institutional and societal changes. But with that, I talked more than 10 minutes. I'm sorry about that, James. I'll get off my soapbox and stop talking, and I'd love to chat about anything. I've had like 6 jobs in 5 years, so I'm very good at resume building and interviewing. I have thoughts about the public sector, the private sector, politics. What any anxiety you might be feeling, whatever you want to talk about, I'm an open book.
So if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and just pose your question directly to Aftab. And if you're shy, I have a couple of questions here from some folks who weren't able to join us today, so I'll go ahead and do one of those to get us started. Aftab, you're pretty well known in the UC law community as a very eloquent and inspiring speaker. Let me flip that and ask you, from where do you draw your inspiration? I mean, no great leader has not experienced similar leadership in their life. Where does that come from with you?
This might be a homer pick literally, but I'm really inspired by my parents. I talked briefly about their journey to this country, and whenever I talk about it, I usually talk about it in a humorous way. But when my mom and dad immigrated to the United States, I think they were like 22, 23 years old. I'm 37 now. I can't imagine, and probably the students who are watching are probably around that age. I can't imagine picking up from a comfortable life in a foreign country, or picking up from my comfortable life here in Ohio and moving to India, a foreign country where the language is a second language, where I don't quite understand the culture, the religion, the food, where there's not a whole lot of people there that look like me. I'm not related to anyone there. Picking up and building a life out of whole cloth, building a community out of whole cloth, the courage and confidence and love between my two parents that must have taken you talk about resiliency. I can't imagine a bigger test for a young couple, and then to raise two boys who are, ultimately, in a secure place. When I was running for Congress, I would talk about just being in awe of my parents and how we talk about the American dream, but in one generation, my family went from being refugees to running in one of the most targeted, contested congressional races in the country, and that only happens in the United States of America, and it only happens because of the courage and commitment of my parents. So whenever I'm facing a tough time or a tough decision, I always try and put myself in their shoes and try and emulate their courage.
That's great. I think we have a question. Christina, you have your hand up?
For taking time out of your day. I really appreciate it. I was just wondering if you had any advice for students going into who have been able to get like internships with a court or through things still virtually this summer, like since you've been working since the pandemic has hit, like I'm just worried about still being able to make the best out of my internship given the social distancing and things like that.
Yeah, so whether it's a remote internship or an in-person internship, the most important thing that you can do as an intern is to show up, is to take initiative, and to follow up regularly. I think a lot of folks in my position, excuse me, getting a call. Sorry about that. I think a lot of folks in my position take for granted that or forget that the interns are there, and so the more that you can think of to be visible, to even come up with work that you could be doing or come up with ideas about how the court could be more efficient. Right now is actually a wonderful time for people in your generation, younger folks who are more technology savvy, to offer to people in position ways that things could be more efficient, could be more accessible, or could be better. Because, I'm actually, as a 37-year-old, I'm like the youngest person in this courthouse on a daily basis. And so you've got, God love them, you've got, baby boomers or people of that generation trying to make decisions about how to conduct a jury trial over Zoom. And they may not be in the best position to do that. You may be. But your ideas won't come to the forefront unless you raise your hand and speak up. So take the initiative, show up, suggest work that you could be or should be doing, and never be afraid that you're underqualified to be suggesting something. The biggest lesson that I've learned, whether it's internship or just my career, is that nobody really knows what they're talking about. Most people are just kind of faking it until they make it. Most people have this veneer of confidence, but underneath they're really insecure about what they're talking about. And so, if you're a person of color, if you're a woman, if you're a younger person, people are always going to tell you to be quiet because you're a person of color, because you're a woman, because you're young, and as a result, you're not qualified. You don't know what you're talking about. I would just ignore all that. I've always found that that's not true, and that your ideas in many instances are just as good.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
That's great. Other questions? We have about 5 minutes left. So as Aftab just said, don't be shy to ask a question if you have one. Aftab, you talked a little bit about access to justice, and I think the Hamilton County Help Center is probably one of the most remarkable projects, from my perspective, that you've accomplished in your 4-year tenure. Certainly a leader in the state and really in the country in terms of the population you've been able to reach and provide them that level playing field to a certain extent. How does that look right now with evictions being shut down, and what does the pipeline for those people look like in terms of when things start to transition back to normal? How does the court manage that?
It's a great question. So right now the court is open, but it's open in a limited way. So only emergency civil matters are moving, and only some criminal matters are moving. All eviction hearings have been suspended. Now that doesn't mean that your landlord can't file for an eviction. They can continue to do that. And because of that misconception, actually, some tenants are not paying their rent because they're under the misunderstanding that they cannot be evicted. They will be evicted once eviction hearings move forward. So we at the Help Center, at the Clerk of Courts, and the courthouse really are worried about that misconception that people can't be evicted and therefore not paying their rent, and B, we're worried that once the evictions start happening, there will be a flood of eviction filings because at the end of July, the federal unemployment benefit expires. And I think given the unemployment rates, there are going to be a lot of desperate people out there, and a lot of desperate tenants and a lot of desperate landlords. So we're very concerned about this tsunami of evictions that we're facing and going to face in the next month or two. So as a result, we've done a few things. First and foremost, we've sent a mailer to every single person every tenant who has a eviction pending, letting them know what their rights are. And I don't know if the tenant information project is still happening, but that's a wonderful way to get involved with some lower income tenants who need some basic legal help. And I was part of that program, and I suggest you do that as well. So we're sending out that mailer. Hopefully that clears up some of that misconception. The second piece of it is we're ramping up our staffing at the Help Center. Obviously, we can't do in-person consultations anymore, but we're creating a call center that we're staffing with clerk staff and volunteer lawyers to give standard legal advice to tenants and to landlords who are facing eviction. And then finally, we're working with the court to slow the eviction process down. Because of social distancing, we are capping cases at 25 cases per docket and having 3 dockets throughout the day. So that will usually eviction court is first thing in the morning, and sometimes there are hundreds of cases. So that will reduce the amount of cases seen in the day, which will give landlords and tenants more time to find a solution. But we are very concerned about the impending eviction crisis, which will then lead to the impending homelessness crisis, and we're trying to nip it in the bud as much as we can.
That's great. I am working with Rob Wall on a reimagining of the tenant information project, given what we have going on. I think there's a new opportunity for students to contribute to that, what's probably going to be a bit of a crisis. So that's good to hear. Okay, we're just at about time. So I just want to say thank you very much. It's really always a pleasure to have you talking to our students. You inspire us with your work. And your UC Law education. So thank you for that, and happy to have you again. Thank you.
James, thanks so much. I appreciate it. To the students who didn't feel comfortable or didn't come up with any questions in this moment, feel free to email me anytime. My email is just my name, aftab.pureval@gmail.com. But James, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone who joined.
Thanks, Aftab.